Hey friends! Welcome back to the Animal Nerd podcast. I'm your host, a future fossil, and I am so happy that you're here. Today, I'm going to be sharing with you the story of an animal who was, to some people, possibly the most sacred being on the planet. This is the story of White Cloud the bison. White Cloud, also known by her Sioux name of Mfia, was a white bison who was born on the Chirrick Buffalo Ranch near Michigan on the 10th of July 1996. And as soon as she was born, her beautiful white fur made her stand out from the other bison. And as a quick side note, this species is technically known as the American bison. However, both historically and now, it's commonly been referred to as the American buffalo. And in the US, both terms are considered appropriate. However, I'm going to be sticking to calling them bison throughout this episode to avoid any confusion with African and water buffalo, which are completely separate species with no real relation to the American bison. However, you might still hear them referred to as buffalo in, quotes and stuff. I just thought I'd explain in case there's any confusion. I know I used to be really unsure about the difference between a bison and a buffalo. But back to White Cloud. As I said, she stood out amongst all the other bison because white bison aren't all that common. Although they're certainly more common now than they used to be. That's because, once upon a time, bison lived in harmony with the land's indigenous inhabitants, who hunted them responsibly and had a great love and respect for the bison. As such, for thousands of years, their numbers were very stable. But then North America was colonised by Europeans, who saw the land as a resource to be exploited. And as these people travelled further and further west across what we now know as the United States, as well as committing atrocities against the people who were already living there, they also decimated the local ecosystems, and this included a lot of irresponsible hunting. As a result, in the late 19th and early 20th century, the bison who had once numbered tens of millions very nearly became extinct. In an effort to both preserve the species and to create an animal that was easier to farm for meat, people began breeding bison with domestic cattle, something which was possible because the two species, though separate, are close enough to breed and produce fertile offspring. These bison-cattle hybrids are typically known as beefalo, and are sometimes still farmed to this day. The whole dream they had to create a more docile bison-type animal never really panned out, but what they did succeed in doing was bulking out the bison's numbers a bit, even though this was mostly through hybrids. And one of the domestic cattle breeds that was commonly used in this interbreeding was a French breed known as the Charolais, a breed which universally has white hair. And so many of the offspring, even if they were brown like their bison parent, carried the gene to produce white offspring. Over the course of many generations, the bison pretty much went back to being actual bisons rather than hybrids. You certainly wouldn't know by looking at them that they had cow blood in them from way back in the day. But those white-haired Charolais genes aren't gone. And so it's not all that uncommon for bison to be born white because of this lingering DNA. In fact, there are some herds that are pretty much all white, because the relevant gene is just particularly common in that area's genetic pool. So in that respect, White Cloud may not have been considered particularly unique, but it would turn out that she was. You see, White Cloud had these beautiful pinky red eyes, and that's something you don't see in bison with the typical white gene. It affects the colour of their fur, yes, but not the colour of their eyes, which remain their natural brown or black. Which proved that White Cloud wasn't white because of long-buried beefalo genes. She was white because she was albino. And this was a big deal. There had never before been a documented case of a truly albino American bison, and White Cloud would later undergo genetic testing to prove 100% that her colour came from albinism. I mean, an albino animal is rare enough, unless it's been deliberately bred. But the fact that she was albino wasn't the reason White Cloud was so important to some people. That was specifically because she was an albino bison. I'm going to explain this as best I can, but it involves a culture that I obviously don't belong to. And while it's an important part of White Cloud's story, and so I obviously don't want to exclude it, I'm also very aware that because this isn't my culture, I'm obviously not the best person to be talking about it, and I really don't want to make any mistakes. So I'm not going to go into too much detail out of respect for those who are part of these cultures and traditions. While I have obviously done my research to try and be as sensitive and accurate as possible, I don't want to risk overstepping any boundaries here and causing harm or offence. But basically, white bison are considered sacred by several Native American cultures. The Lakota have told the story of Tessin Y, or White Buffalo Calf Woman as she's known in English, for over 2,000 years, and as with all oral history, there are several versions of the legend. But the general gist is that a young woman appeared to them, first in the form of a white bison calf. She presented the Lakota people with a sacred ceremonial pipe called the Chanunpa, and taught the Lakota people 7 sacred ceremonies. Tessin Y is a holy figure, and because she sometimes took the form of a white bison calf, white bison are also seen as sacred, as an omen that the people's prayers had been heard and good times were coming. And white bison aren't only seen as sacred by the Lakota, they're also viewed that way by the Sioux, Cherokee, Navajo, Dakota, and Comanche people. And white bison used to be a much rarer occurrence. Before the introduction of domesticated cattle DNA, pretty much the only reason a bison would be white is due to something like albinism. Albinism is incredibly rare, especially in the wild, where albino animals don't tend to live long due to their inability to camouflage and the fact that albinism negatively affects their eyesight. The frequency is about 1 in 10 million. So, needless to say, when an albino bison calf was born, it was a very, very rare thing. White bison are a lot more common now, of course, for the reasons I've already given, and from what I can tell, I think the non-albino white bison are still seen as sacred, especially when they're born in the wild. But the fact that White Cloud was albino, a truer and rarer form of whiteness than the others, caused her to be seen as even more sacred. But again, I couldn't find much that spelt this out, so I do apologise if I've gotten anything wrong. And if you do belong to any of the indigenous communities that revere white bison, then please do feel free to contact me if I have. The last thing I ever want to do in this podcast is to cause disrespect or harm to marginalised groups that I don't belong to. So yeah, White Cloud was kind of a big deal, and not long after she was born, she ended up moving to the National Buffalo Museum, which is now known as the North American Bison Discovery Center. The Discovery Center is a 501c3 non-profit organisation, whose mission is basically to spread education and awareness about bison, their role as a keystone species in the Great Plains ecosystem, their historical and cultural significance, and how they're one of the US's greatest conservation success stories, after being saved from the brink of extinction. They have all the exhibits and stuff you'd expect, but perhaps their biggest draw, or at least it would be for me, is their herd of around 30 live bison, who live on 200 acres of pasture land, living what's pretty close to a natural wild life. And given how special White Cloud was, it's not really surprising that they wanted her to join their herd. Pretty much as soon as she arrived at the Bison Discovery Center, White Cloud was an instant hit. It seems like everyone loved her. The center's herd of bison can be seen from Interstate 94, as some of their pasture borders the road, and given how much she stood out from other bison, I'm sure she brought in more visitors just by standing out in the field. The Discovery Center is located in Jamestown, North Dakota, which is kind of the bison capital of the United States. Like, it's literally known as the Buffalo City. Of course they have the North American Bison Discovery Center, but they also have the world's largest buffalo, which isn't an actual animal. It's a 26-foot-tall concrete sculpture of a bison that's been there since the late 1950s, and apparently it's specifically an anatomically correct male, so that's a mental image I'll leave you with. But White Cloud's presence seemed to drive the city even more bison crazy than before, with them eventually launching White Cloud Days, which were these big community events that would sometimes last for a full weekend. Although they were named after White Cloud, who was perhaps Jamestown's most famous resident, they weren't all specifically bison-themed. They were more just opportunities for the local community to get together and celebrate their shared identity. They'd have things like these big pancake breakfasts at the local firehouse to raise money to buy new firefighting equipment, that kind of thing. They'd also have parades, craft sales, classic car shows, food vendors, kids' activities, live music, pony rides, dirt track car races, religious services, pie eating competitions, all sorts. Honestly, it just seems really fun, and it was so popular that White Cloud Days were held long after their namesake passed away. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's talk about White Cloud's life before we talk about her death. As I said, White Cloud was a big draw for the Discovery Center, and a beloved member of the community. She helped educate people on the spiritual and cultural significance of white bison, and during her lifetime, she attracted an estimated 3 million visitors to Jamestown. She was also regularly featured in Jamestown tourism adverts. In the year 2000, White Cloud gave birth for the first time, to a female calf who was named Princess Winona, a very fitting name as Winona means firstborn daughter in the Lakota language. And if the Discovery Center were hoping for a second albino bison to join their herd, they were severely disappointed. Princess Winona was a typical brown bison. White Cloud welcomed her second child into the world on the 12th of May 2003, which was actually the day after Mother's Day. This time she gave birth to a son, who once again was brown. In fact, White Cloud's first 4 calves would all be standard brown. It wasn't until she gave birth to her 5th calf in the spring of 2007 that White Cloud finally had a white baby. This calf was a male, and his name, Dakota Miracle, was chosen via a community contest. It was assumed that he was albino, although as was the case with White Cloud, they wanted to do genetic tests to confirm this for sure. And then only the next year, yet another white calf was born into the herd, but this time White Cloud wasn't the mother. Instead, it was one of the other females, a normal brown bison. Although it was still believed that this calf, who was also male, was a descendant of White Cloud, more specifically that he was her grandson, having been sired by one of her adult sons. Obviously, Dakota Miracle, the only white male, was far too young to be the father. Instead, it was assumed that it must have been one of White Cloud's brown sons, who carried her albino genes despite not showing it. This second white calf was also named via a public competition. Possibly the same one in which Dakota Miracle was named, I couldn't quite tell. Either way, he was named Dakota Legend. This brought the total number of white bison in the herd to 3, and 2 white calves being born so close together naturally brought in a lot of attention, especially to indigenous people to whom white bison calves are such an important omen. D. Joyce Kitson, also known by her Lakota name of Pehinsawin, is a Hunkpapa Lakota Hidatsa artist and folklorist, who said of the birth, quote, "The calf is another sign that God is going to bless our children. We have to come alongside our young to help them become what they want to be. When there is love there, it heals." End quote. White Cloud would go on to have 13 calves during her time at the North American Bison Discovery Center, although from what I can tell, only one of these was white, that being the aforementioned Dakota Miracle. And of course there was Dakota Legend, who, while not her son, was probably her grandson, although I'm not sure if that was 100% confirmed. Given that White Cloud was believed to be the first truly albino bison to be documented, there were some concerns that her albinism could lead to health problems, as it was a genetic mutation that wasn't really known about in her species. And I mean, yeah, animals evolved to be specific colours for a reason. When an animal is drastically different, that can lead to issues, and it certainly did for White Cloud. For one thing, she often stood apart from the other bison in the herd, preferring to shelter beneath trees and brush. It's well documented that albinism causes problems with vision due to the lack of pigment in the eye, and because bright sunlight can make those problems worse, it's believed that that was the reason for White Cloud's preference for the shady spots. She was also prone to getting sunburn in the summer because, again, she didn't have the melanin in her skin to protect her from UV rays. She also had real problems when it came to regulating her body temperature, struggling to cool down in the summer and stay warm in the winter. The 2 white calves were described by sources as being healthy and behaving like any other bison calves. However, if they were albino like White Cloud, then I would assume that they went on to develop similar issues. Although I did find one source that referred to Dakota Miracle as being leucistic and not albino. Leucism is very similar to albinism, one of the main differences being that leucism can affect all pigment in the skin, whereas albinism only affects melanin. Regardless, they both tend to present very similarly and can easily be mistaken for one another in many species. I couldn't actually find anything as to whether or not non-albino white bison experience the same problems with regulating their body temperatures. They wouldn't have the eyesight issues as the Charolais gene doesn't affect the pigment in their eyes, and assuming that they don't have pink skin, then sunburn also wouldn't be an issue. But I don't know about the temperature one. I don't know if that's caused by the colour of the skin or the hair. Either way, as White Cloud continued to age, her health struggles became more pronounced, and after almost 2 decades of being the most popular resident at the North American Bison Discovery Center, White Cloud returned to her birthplace of the Chirrut Buffalo Ranch in May 2016. She'd reached a point where, with her declining health, she needed more care. Throughout the summer, she was fed good quality hay and corn, rather than being put out to pasture, which could have caused stress. And then, on Monday the 14th of November 2016, when she was 20 years old, White Cloud passed away peacefully of old age. Her death was announced the very next day, with Don Williams, president of the National Buffalo Museum as it was then still known, saying to the press, quote, "To me, White Cloud was more than a tourist attraction. She drew many, many people to the community, but more than that, she brought the community together with White Cloud Days, parades, and special Native American events. She will be missed by our museum, our city, and by all the travellers that could look north and view her as they drove along the I-94 interstate pasture." End quote. White Cloud's many fans and admirers took to social media to share their photos and memories of her, and to express their grief at her loss, and donations were raised to fund the creation of a full-body mount, which would later be displayed in the museum alongside a plaque explaining to the visitors who she was and sharing about her life. White Cloud may have been gone, but she was survived by her children, including, of course, her white son Dakota Miracle. And on the 1st of June 2018, another albino bison came from the Chirrut Buffalo Ranch to join the herd at the North American Bison Discovery Center. This was a 1-year-old female who was also a descendant of White Cloud, and every bit as beautiful. She was initially there on a trial period to see how she settled in, and I couldn't find anything to say for sure if she ended up staying, so I don't know. I also don't know what she would have ended up being named, but then maybe she didn't get one if she didn't stay. Sadly, in June 2019, during a routine herd inspection by staff at the Discovery Center, it was found that White Cloud's son Dakota Miracle had passed away. He'd fallen into a ravine and was too severely injured to survive. It's believed that his poor eyesight, which was of course caused by his lack of pigment, led to the accident. He was only 13 years old. And as much as I really hate to end these episodes on such a somber note, that's White Cloud's story. One glimmer of light, though, is that from what I can tell, White Cloud days continued even after her passing and remained as days for the community to come together. So at least that's something. And while neither White Cloud nor Dakota Miracle are still with us, their memory lives on in those who knew and loved them. That's a slightly less depressing way to wrap up this episode, right? I really hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you didn't find the ending too sad. I'm sorry if you did. Thank you so much for listening. I really hope I did an okay job of talking about white buffalo calf women and the indigenous beliefs around white bisons. I'm always kind of paranoid when it comes to covering marginalised communities that I'm not a part of, especially spiritual beliefs, because I never want to cause offence or upset or anything like that. I realise I said pretty much the same thing earlier, but it's true. And again, if I did get anything wrong at all, then please let me know. I'm always doing my best to be a good ally and a good person, but of course there's always room to learn and grow. But yeah, thank you so much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed this week's episode. I've already said that bit. Usual stuff, you know the drill by now. Our sources, social media, website, contact info, all of that can be found in the show notes, as would a link to the North American Bison Discovery Centre's website if you want to check them out. Whenever I feature a charity or non-profit organisation in any of these episodes, I always like to include links to their websites so you can find out more about them and support and donate to them if you want to and are able. I think that's everything. I don't know why this outro is such a mess. Apparently I've forgotten how to podcast? Great. Oh, yeah. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the show if you haven't already, and give us a nice review, or a mean one if you want. I'm not the boss of you. Tell your friends, comment and like the video if you're listening via YouTube, and I think that's everything. I think I've got it now. Thank you once again for being here. The Animal Nerd podcast comes out with a brand new episode every single Tuesday, plus bonus minisodes at least once a month. So I will see you then, by which time I will hopefully have regained what little grasp on my podcasting skills I ever had. Stay wild, friends!